Van Damme was so dangerous that, during a film shoot, a stuntman ended up losing the vision in one eye. He injured numerous stunt performers while trying to adapt to Hollywood standards. But why are Van Damme's kicks so dangerous? During the filming of his movies, more than one stuntman discovered something unsettling about Jean-Claude Van Damme. When one of his kicks landed a few inches closer than intended, it stopped looking like a movie and started looking like a real fight. And that was no accident. While many actors learned how to throw punches for the camera, Van Damme had spent years training in competitive karate and kickboxing, developing a level of leg speed that would become one of the most famous in action movie history. When he accelerated, he did not look like an actor performing choreography. He looked like a fighter trying to reach the target before it could react. What made his kicks special was not just their height. Many martial artists could raise a leg to an opponent's head. The difference was the combination of flexibility, speed, balance, and precision. Van Damme could launch attacks from angles that seemed impossible without sacrificing power or control. His movements were so fluid that opponents often started reacting only after his leg was already returning to position. That speed turned his techniques into more than cinematic moves. It turned them into his signature. One of his most feared weapons was the high roundhouse kick. On paper, it looks like a basic technique, but executing it like Van Damme was a completely different story. The kick appeared out of nowhere, traveled toward the opponent's head, and disappeared before many viewers could even process what they had just seen. That ability was immortalized in films like Bloodsport and Kickboxer, where numerous opponents seemed to realize far too late that they were already within range of his legs. But perhaps even more impressive was his body control. The famous split was not merely a visual trick designed to impress audiences. It was a demonstration of extraordinary flexibility that allowed him to maintain balance in positions where most people would simply fall over. Because of that, he could throw high kicks while remaining perfectly stable on one leg and chain attacks together without losing his posture. While other fighters needed to reset after every technique, Van Damme could continue attacking immediately, creating a constant sense of pressure on his opponents. That advantage became even more obvious when he used spinning kicks in films like Double Impact and Lionheart. These techniques require coordination, timing, and tremendous spatial awareness, because for a fraction of a second, the fighter loses sight of the target while spinning. Yet Van Damme seemed to execute them effortlessly. He would spin, find the target, and land the strike with a level of precision that made an incredibly difficult technique look simple. And once he landed, he was ready to attack again almost immediately. That is why his fight scenes felt so different. It was not just a matter of choreography. It was the result of real physical attributes developed through years of obsessive training. His techniques looked fast because they genuinely were fast. They looked dangerous because they were built upon real combat fundamentals. And when we watch his battles against opponents like Chong Li in Bloodsport, Tong Po in Kickboxer, or the brutal fights of Lionheart and Double Impact, we understand why those scenes still work decades later. The kicks do not look like they were designed merely to look good on camera. They look like they were designed to land. And that is where the most interesting question of all begins to emerge. Because nobody is born with that kind of speed. Nobody is born with that kind of flexibility. Nobody is born capable of building an entire career around their legs. Behind those techniques were years of training, thousands of repetitions, and a competitive fighting career that Hollywood rarely talks about. And when we look at what Van Damme accomplished before becoming a movie star, we begin to understand why so many stunt performers respected his kicks, and why his opponents on screen always seemed to arrive a fraction of a second too late. Because if Van Damme's kicks already looked dangerous in movies, just how good were they when he used them against real fighters? When people think of Jean-Claude Van Damme, they usually think of the movies. They remember Frank Dukes defeating Chong Li. They remember Kurt Sloan facing Tong Po. They remember the spinning kicks, the impossible splits, and some of the most iconic action scenes of the 80s. But there is one detail many people do not know. Before becoming an action star, Van Damme had already spent years fighting for real. And that completely changes the way you look at his movies. Because when we watch those kicks on screen, We are not simply watching an actor who learned martial arts for a role. We are watching someone who had competed in karate and kickboxing, gaining real experience against opponents who were actively trying to beat him. For years, he trained in Shotokan karate, developing precision, discipline, and technical control. Later, he added kickboxing, a system that transformed those techniques into something much more aggressive, faster, and more explosive. It was that combination that ultimately created the style millions of people would later recognize in Hollywood. What is interesting is that Van Damme did not stand out solely because of his flexibility. Many competitors could raise their legs to impressive heights. What truly separated him from the rest was the speed with which he could do it. He had developed an extraordinary ability to throw kicks without giving away any warning signs, no unnecessary movement, no telegraphing, no warning. One moment he was standing still, the next, his leg was already traveling toward his opponent's head. That ability to close distance explosively became one of his most dangerous weapons both inside and outside the ring. And perhaps that is where we find the real reason his movies felt different. Because Van Damme did not have to imagine how a fighter moved. He already knew. He had felt the pressure of real fights. He had trained under real rules. He had learned what happens when a strike arrives too late and when an opening appears for a fraction of a second. That experience would constantly reveal itself in his choreography. That is why so many of his fight scenes possess an aggression that other actors simply could not replicate. They do not look like movements learned for a movie. They look like movements born from combat. And when Hollywood finally placed a camera in front of him, something extraordinary happened. All of that training began to merge with his exceptional flexibility. Suddenly, kicks appeared that seemed impossible. Spinning kicks, jumping kicks, kicks launched from absurd angles. Techniques that looked fast not only to audiences, but also to many martial artists watching those films. Over the years, martial artists bigger than Van Damme appeared. Fighters stronger than Van Damme appeared. Competitors with better records appeared. There were even athletes capable of performing some of the same techniques. Yet almost nobody managed to replicate what turned Van Damme into a legend. Because the secret was never just the kicks themselves. The secret was the way he made them feel. When a Van Damme fight scene began, the audience knew exactly what they were waiting for. They knew that sooner or later, an impossible kick was coming. And yet it still worked. It still impressed. Because there was something special about the way he moved. His legs seemed to arrive faster. They seemed to cover more distance. They seemed to appear from angles that other actors simply could not reproduce. And when they finally landed, the visual impact was so spectacular that it often became the most memorable moment of the entire scene. That is something very few martial artists have ever achieved in the history of cinema. And that is the real answer to the question posed in this video. People do not remember Van Damme because he could kick high. People do not remember Van Damme because he was flexible. People remember Van Damme because he turned his legs into the most famous weapons in Hollywood. Because when we talk about kicks, when we talk about speed, when we talk about flexibility, and when we talk about visual impact, we always arrive at exactly the same conclusion that action movie fans have been repeating for more than 3 decades. Nobody kicks like Jean-Claude Van Damme. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend this other one about Van Damme, where I take a deeper look at his years competing in karate and kickboxing, as well as his records. Don't miss it. Support the channel with your valuable like, subscribe, and I'll see you in that awesome video.